All right, Alexander. So, following up from our last video where we discussed the July crisis and the possibility of Austria going to war with Serbia and that triggering the various alliances into a much wider war, we now have the fact that Austria has indeed declared war on Serbia. What does this mean? Where are we heading with all of
We're
this?
heading straight, yeah, straightforwardly, we are heading straight into an all-out European war. And obviously, decision-making in Vienna has been catastrophically bad. And I think that we're going to discover that the Habsburgs, the Austrian government, has made a colossal miscalculation about what it is doing. But the decision-making in Berlin has been, if anything, worse still. And I think, first of all, let's talk about Austria, because they've decided to go to war with Serbia. They have convinced themselves that Serbia is an existential threat to the Habsburg monarchy. Not entirely clear why. They seem to think that every Slav in the Habsburg Empire is a potential secessionist or rebel. They've convinced themselves that, Serbia is somehow allied with all the Slavs across the Habsburg Empire. Now, anybody who knows about this knows that this is completely ludicrous. I mean, if we talk about the situation in, say, Prague, which is, and, the Czech lands, well, the Czechs have major issues, extremely great issues with the government in Vienna, but they don't seem to be in any mood to actually secede from the empire. And the idea that the Slavs in Prague, who are highly technologically advanced, industrialized, prosperous, middle-class people, have any, and by the way, Catholic, have anything in common with the Slavs in the south in a place like Bosnia, which is much more rural, orthodox place. I mean, it's just ludicrous. I mean, it's just paranoid stuff, and is a good indication of how paranoid thinking can capture a government and can lead it on into crazy decisions. And of course, what the government in Vienna is doing is, of course, it's starting, in effect, a European war, because it believes that it's going to save itself from a crisis with the Slavs, the internal crisis with the Slavs, by sort of attacking Serbia. And of course, what it's going to do, I think, is it's going to start a European war in which Serbia will be backed by Russia. That is now inevitable. And, we're going to come to the other side of this. And of course, what that is going to do, that kind of European war, is likely to achieve precisely what this war against Serbia, which is bound to involve Russia, bound to involve all of Europe, is intended to achieve. It is going to end in the collapse of the Austrian monarchy, because, of course, the Slavs of the empire now know that the government in Vienna is fundamentally and implacably hostile to them, that it sees them in effect as second-class citizens. And it means that there's now going to be a general war in Europe in which inevitably they're going to seek the opportunity to break away. So this is a stupid, reckless policy. I would also add that the Austrians are totally unprepared for this. They have this disastrous miscalculation. They think that they can defeat Serbia fast. They completely underestimate the toughness of the Serbian army, and, by the way, of the Serbian people, who are, people who are have a very long history and tradition of defending themselves. After all, it's not very long since they were part of the Ottoman Empire, and they fought against the Ottomans for their independence heroically. So I think the Austrians are completely underestimating their ability to win this war against Serbia. I think they think they'll be over within a couple of days. In practice, I think it is going to take very much longer. And, of course, at the same time as they're doing that, they're stripping their eastern border of troops to concentrate them against Serbia, which, of course, leaves their eastern regions dangerously exposed to the inevitable offensive by Russia, which is going to push it dangerously into the heart of the Habsburg Empire. So policy in Vienna is, I think it's gone completely crazy. I mean, they produced this crazy ultimatum. They were clearly looking for a war. They've now got a war, and all it's going to do is it's going to destroy Austria, one of the oldest nations, one of the old, not nation states, but one of the oldest states in Europe, an empire that can be traced back all the way to the Holy Roman Empire of Charlemagne in 800, which was created in 800 AD. So they're going to destroy that. But their folly is, as I said, compounded by that of Germany, who've again talked themselves into this extraordinary fear of this alliance by Russia and France, and at the same time they've convinced that time is running out for Germany. And they've also, of course, as the same time as they've become paranoid, they've become megalomaniac. They think that, this is the moment for Germany to seize, that this is the moment of its manifest destiny and all this. So the Germans have told the Russians that Russia shouldn't mobilize in support of Serbia, and they're now preparing to declare war on Russia, and crazily, they're apparently also planning to declare war on France. So, I mean, the Germans have been working, supposedly, to try to break this encirclement, as they call it, of themselves, trying to avoid a two-front war, and instead they're provoking it. Now, I understand there's been some alarm at the last moment in Berlin. Some people, including the Kaiser himself, apparently had cold feet at the last moment. But effectively, as they say, the train has left the station. All the decisions were taken. Berlin encouraged Vienna in its folly. It couldn't rein in the Austrians. And now, of course, the Germans are trapped in the logic of this crazy policy that they've taken upon themselves. So the result is we're going to end up in a European war. Austria is going to be destroyed. Germany is going to be survive, I suspect. But at the same time, it is launching a war which is going to bring to bear against Germany forces which are ultimately more powerful than itself. Germany cannot win a war against Britain, France, and Russia all at the same time. And with the United States across the Atlantic eyeing its opportunities and becoming, in many ways, increasingly close to Britain, it's quite likely that at some point the United States will eventually join such a war against Germany. And of course, Italy, which was Germany's ally up to now, has been utterly shocked by the recklessness of German policy and has now made it very clear that it is not part of this and is also looking to switch sides. So, as I said, people in Berlin and Vienna have taken leave of their senses. They're starting a European war, one which wasn't necessary, one which the situation didn't call for. They are scaring themselves with fantastic fears, and they're bringing about a situation which will make those fears real.
Okay, we covered the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in our previous video. Can you just explain what exactly, and that's been used as the trigger to this declaration of war, whether it's true or not, whether you believe it or not, let's just leave that for another time. That's been used as the excuse to declare war. What exactly, though, is the scope of the war for Austria against Serbia? What are they looking to achieve? I mean, what's the end point for this war? And going even further, for Germany, if and when Germany also declares war on both fronts, as you said, Russia and France, what exactly is Germany trying to achieve? Is this just about protecting their east and western flanks, or is there something more that they're looking to achieve? Are they looking to become the next hegemon and then eventually take on the British in a battle between the two powers? I mean, I'm trying to understand, what is their end goal in doing this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very, very good question because, of course, a lot of people are struggling to understand what the thinking behind all of this is because it's very difficult to see what the thinking is. Now, as I said, presumably the Austrians want to knock out Serbia. Now, what that means exactly, what knocking out Serbia involves is not exactly clear, but, you know, they're going to march on Belgrade. I would add Belgrade is extremely well defended, something which it seems the Austrians are not aware of. And breaking through to Belgrade might prove to be much more difficult for the Austrians than they imagine. But again, one has to ask the question of this. Let's assume that the Austrians achieve their objective. Let's say they march on Belgrade, they capture Belgrade, they capture the whole of Serbia. All they're going to do in that case, if they succeed, if this policy were to succeed, is that they're going to have more angry Slavs within, under their control, which is presumably what, if you really do believe having Slavs in your empire is a problem, Austria should be seeking to avoid. I mean, it seems, completely illogical. So one gets the sense that there's this, enormous anger in Vienna against Serbia, not just over, the murder of the Archduke, which I want to say a few things about, by the way, but that they have this sort of massive animus against Serbia, a massive animus against Russia as well. They've come to see Russia specifically as the cause of the empire's internal problems, which anybody who studies the internal politics of the Habsburg Empire knows is absurd. So, but, whatever it is that they're trying to do, it's difficult to see how it's going to solve those problems. It's more likely to make them worse. So, as I said, we're going to have a war which it's impossible to see what the plan is and how any result can possibly be good for Austria. One suspects yet again that there are these extremely strange neocon figures in Vienna. There are people like that, people who think in this kind of way, people who see some kind of, Germanic suzerainty, hegemony over Central Europe, and that these people have now managed to basically capture control of the government in Austria. And as I said, have been driving them to these follies. But Germany, it's even stranger because, of course, Germany is economically very successful and looks likely to continue to be. It's, becoming an increasingly prosperous country. The Chancellor, the great statesman who created modern Germany, Bismarck, has made it very clear, well, until he died a few years ago, he made it absolutely clear that in his opinion, what Germany needed to do was pursue a policy of peace and should seek peace in Europe. But again, we now have this strange set of policies which appear to be deliberately seeking to trigger a European war. Now, many people are scratching their heads and trying to make sense of this. And there's some people who say that this is because of an internal crisis in Germany. And it has been the case that in recent elections to the German parliament, the Reichstag, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which is a left-wing socialist party, which has adopted the philosophy of Karl Marx, that it won a very large number of votes in that election, around a third of the votes, and some conservative Germans apparently are extremely alarmed about this. I find that a bizarre idea because, yes, it's a left-wing social democratic party and it is influenced to some extent by Marxist thinking. But most people who have followed the SPD realise that it's actually a pretty conservative party. It's certainly nothing like the revolutionary parties in Russia. and it doesn't really pose any conceivable threat to the German government. So that makes little sense, it seems to me. There is, I'm afraid, a more likely view, a view that's, I think, more likely to be driving this. Firstly, there is a sense that unless Germany acts now, it won't be Germany which will become the most powerful country in Europe. It will be Russia, where the economy has also been growing fast and where the military has been getting much stronger over the last few years. So there are some people who think that, but we're getting dribs and drabs of reports about a meeting that happened about a year ago in which the Kaiser brought together a number of top German officials, and where apparently one of them, a man called Hosbach, apparently wrote out a memorandum. And it set out an absolutely lunatic scheme whereby Germany starts, a war, a pan-European war. It defeats France. It then turns on Russia. It then conquers vast areas of Russia and harnesses them into the German economic system, and then uses the economic power that these regions provided, especially, the food and raw materials, to launch some great bid for world hegemony against Britain. I mean, these are lunatic ideas, but there are some people in Germany, call them again neocons, they're all of them, people who claim to be right-wing, but who are really, in no sense, conservative. They have these extraordinary megalomaniac projects. And unfortunately, it seems that these people have great influence within the German government. They've obviously had access to the Kaiser himself. And of course, they're very heavily embedded in the army. And the result is, as I said, and the security services. So the result is we have this lunatic project of starting a world war, a general European conflagration, which apparently they see Germany coming out on top in, dominating Europe, and then using that as a springboard to challenge Britain and ultimately the United States. I mean, it is folly piled on folly, and it is certain to end in disaster.
Did you want to say something about the Archduke, the assassination?
Yeah,
You said you wanted to mention something.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about this because, it's very important to understand that this is a pretext for a war. It is not the cause. I mean, the Austrians have made the Germans have all made a huge issue about, how this is a terrible murder and that Serbia is somehow responsible for it. What's become increasingly clear since the assassination is what a deeply unpopular figure within the Austrian government and court the Archduke actually was. The Emperor, it is now clear, Franz Joseph, absolutely detested him, and he's been absolutely delighted to appoint the person that he always wanted as his successor, the Archduke Charles, to that position. So, I mean, the Emperor is secretly pleased to have Franz Ferdinand out of the way. And so is the rest of the German government. And inevitably and unavoidably, that has increased the suspicions that many people have that Franz Ferdinand was sent to Sarajevo in the full knowledge that he was likely to be exposed to some kind of terrorist act, in the full expectation that that would happen. And one gets increasingly the sense that all of this thing, these wars against Serbia, this war now against Russia, which looks inevitable, that it all had been in somebody's, plan all along. So, I mean, the whole thing, as I said, is we should not fall for the narrative that it was this murder that has provoked this war. It is clearly the planning, the intention of some extremely hardline people in Vienna and Berlin. Call them neocons if you like.
All right, before we get to Russia and how prepared Russia is to jump into this war, and I've got some sources about Rasputin as well, that he's actually sent a letter to the Tsar. We'll get into that about the war. He's warned the Tsar about the war. But before we get to that, Germany against the British. This is very interesting for me. Would you say that this was inevitable? This was going to happen one way or another? In other words, a type of Thucydides trap, in that you have the hegemon is going to have to take on the what is thought to be the rising power. In other words, this was inevitable to happen, that either one would overtake the other and submit to the other, or they would just, come into conflict with each other. Do you see it like that? This is kind of inevitable. This was an inevitable outcome, one way or another, that you would have Germany going up against Britain. Because at the end of the day, this is what I see as the end game. If you look forward, maybe 6 months to a year from now, the end game is these two powers going at it.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I think that probably is the ultimate story of this thing, that the Germany sees itself as the rising power, and Britain sees Germany as the main challenger. And what we've seen is German diplomacy becoming increasingly paranoid as Britain has been trying to contain Germany. And the result has been a crisis in Europe, which has now escalated into war. But it's important always to stress that that didn't make war inevitable, because, of course, there are choices. People always have a choice. One shouldn't think that this is a mechanical thing, that people are obliged to go to war because they find themselves in these sort of situations. It is bad decisions in Berlin, and now we're going to come to London. But before we do that, I want to discuss a memorandum that was sent to the Tsar by a man called Piotr Dornovo, because it touches precisely on this issue of the conflict between Britain and Germany. Now, if you take your mind back a couple of years to some of our earlier programs, at the time of the 1905-1906 uprising in Russia, the revolution as it's called, Piotr Dornovo was the interior minister. And he was an extremely tough and effective figure, and he brought the whole situation in Russia under control. But after that, he had a falling out with the Tsar, and Stolypin didn't like him, and he was forced to retire, but he always remains an influential person behind the scenes. Now, it's now become known that a couple of months ago, Dornovo sent a memorandum to the Tsar, and in it he discussed the international situation. And and also talked about the domestic situation in Russia too. And he made exactly the point that you just made. He said that Europe seemed to be heading towards a war, and that the reason that there was going to be a war was because Britain, which Dornovo clearly doesn't like and sees as the major force driving the prospect of a war in Europe, that Britain is working overtime to try to contain Germany. Germany opposes this, and that sooner or later there is going to be a war between Germany and Britain. And Dornovo's point is that Britain can only win that kind of a war if it can involve Russia on its side in it. And that in the event that there is such a war, it will be Russia, which has by far the biggest army against Germany amongst all the potential allies that Britain has, that will have to do all the heavy lifting. And this is completely contrary to Russian national interests. This is Dornovo's point. He says, why should Russia sacrifice itself to help Britain preserve its position as the world leading power? Why should Russia expend its blood and treasure in such an objective? And Dornovo has made 2 points. He said that the political situation, the domestic political situation in Russia remains tense. The liberals remain profoundly hostile to the government. A lot of the working class has been won over by the revolutionary socialist parties led by Lenin. And so the government has to worry about the domestic situation, and a world war, a war with Germany, might put Russian society under extreme pressure. But that even if there was a victory, which there could be, because Russia would do most of the fighting, but the winner would be Britain, and that once the war was over and Germany had been defeated, Britain would turn on Russia, because at that point it would be Russia that would replace Germany as Britain's major challenger. So this is the memorandum that Dornovos sent to Nicholas, and I think it is extremely insightful. I mean, he grasps exactly the point that you're making, that it's the British and the Germans and their paranoid fears of each other that are the ultimate cause of this war, and Germany's aspiration to replace Britain as the world hegemon, Britain's desire to keep Germany down. That's what's creating this immediate crisis. But Dornovo has made the point that from a Russian point of view, Russia gains nothing by involving itself in this quarrel. It risks an internal crisis and possibly a revolution. And if that is avoided and it ends in victory, if Russia defeats Germany on behalf of Britain, Britain will then immediately turn on Russia. So that's the point that Dornovo has made, and it's very, very insightful. It's known that the Tsar himself, Nicholas, took this memorandum extremely seriously, but he's not been able to act on it, and we need to discuss, I suppose, why.
Yeah. Okay. That leads into my my final questions here. The final questions that I have for you. The first question that I have is: all right, Austria has declared war on Serbia. Russia has to now jump into this war. Do they have to jump into this war? I mean, I said they have to, but my question is kind of they have to, but do they really have to? In other words, why does Russia have to get involved in this? Is this an existential threat to the empire, to the Tsar? In other words,
Yes.
there is no choice. They have to come to the back of Serbia. And the second question that I have is, the second part is Russia prepared?
Yes. Okay.
For a war, which will eventually mean a war with Germany as well. Because just a little context, Alexander, because an interesting side story is that Rasputin, we talked about how Rasputin was banished out of St. Petersburg. He went back to his home in Siberia. And it is said, this is from my sources, that, there was an assassination attempt on Rasputin. He was a woman by the name of Gustava, I believe, a peasant woman, prostitute with a face disfigurement. She stabbed him in the stomach. Very brutal attempt to assassinate him. And supposedly Gustava is a follower of Iliodor, who we did a video on as well. Iliodor was his friend. They had a falling out. And anyway, it looks like she tried to murder Rasputin. And I believe Iliodor has now fled Russia as well. Anyway, Rasputin has recovered. He is recovering, but he did write a letter to the royal family, to Alexander specifically, and to the Tsar, where he begged. He said he had visions, and he begged the Tsar not to get involved in this, what is going to be a world war. His vision said it was going to be bloody. It would be the end of the Russian Empire as well.
Yes.
This is what my sources are telling me with this letter that he sent to the royal family. That just adds a little bit more of intrigue and context as you answer the two parts of the question.
Absolutely. Now, just consider, you have an extremely sophisticated political figure like Dornovos, somebody who served in the government for many times, who's one of the most highly educated and erudite people in Russia, warning the Tsar against a war, telling the Tsar, or if you find yourself, you get dragged into a war with Germany, then you're putting the entire existence of the empire of Russia itself in jeopardy. And you have, at the absolute opposite extreme, Rasputin, who's barely literate, a peasant, and somebody who, as I said, is not known to have very sophisticated political views, and he's advising the Tsar exactly the same thing. And frankly, I think that represents the entire spectrum of Russian society, except for two blocks of extremely influential and powerful people. You have people from the conservative political class who are dead against a war because they see this would be dangerous for the empire. And you see the peasant in Siberia who's also against the war. He says, why should we get involved in a war? It's nothing to do with us. If we get into a war, it'll only be bad for us. And of course, it could result in the overthrow of the monarchy. And I would remind you again of what we discussed in our previous program. The German ambassador in St. Petersburg a couple of months ago actually sent a report to Berlin in which he said that nobody in Russia, nobody in St. Petersburg, no member of the government wants war with Germany. Now, the Tsar doesn't want war with Germany. Most of the officials of the government don't want war in Germany. The Tsar has made a major effort over the last couple of days to prevent a war taking place. He's written to the Kaiser, who is, of course, a member of his family. He's tried to negotiate directly with the Kaiser to try to diffuse this crisis. The Kaiser has been sending one message which contradicts the other. I mean, it's made absolutely no sense what kind of information the Tsar, he's sending to the Tsar. It just doesn't seem to have any effect anyway on the direction of policy. And there are reports that the Tsar himself is deeply upset and very concerned and alarmed about the situation. Now, is Russia ready for war? Now, let's first of all discuss that before we discuss who in Russia wants war. Now, the answer is it's in a much better state to fight a war than it was, say, 5 years ago. There's been a major reorganization of the army. The army's in much better shape than it was some years ago. And obviously, Russia has considerably developed its industrial base. But it's essential to understand that all of this is very much still a work in progress. The Russian army is still not fully re-equipped with modern weapons. There is a major rearmament program, which is due to come to crystallize in a couple of years, but they're not ready there yet. And of course, the political situation within Russia itself remains tense. There are plans within some of the ministries, especially some of the economic ministries and within the general staff, for creating what you might call a mobilization economy, a centrally planned mobilization economy, such as would be needed to enable Russia to win a war. But it's universally accepted that at the moment, Russia is not politically ready for the implementation of those kind of mobilization plans, and Russia is not, its infrastructure isn't ready for that either. In 5 years' time, it would be different. So that's one factor that is undoubtedly playing into this. The Russians are in a better position to wage a war, much better position to wage a war than they were a few years ago. But they are not fully ready now. There is another problem, which is that there are serious doubts about the competence of the commander-in-chief of the Russian army. And here I've got to say something very quickly about the way politics works in Russia. The person who is the overall commander-in-chief is Grand Prince Nikolai Nikolaevich. Now, he is universally believed amongst the top military officers to be incompetent, at least incompetent in the post of supreme command. He is on very bad terms with the Tsar himself, but he is in the position in which he is in because he has powerful support from certain members of the court, from the liberals, and also from some people on the ultra-nationalist side. He's represented himself as a sort of pro-liberal, pro-nationalist figure, and the result is that he can always whip up a media campaign on his behalf whenever Nicholas looks like he might want to remove him. So he's in this position where he's presiding over this army that's increasingly getting better, but most people think that he's simply not up to the job. Now, who wants a war? The Liberals want a war. The Liberals want a war because, as far as they're concerned, they want Russia to be allied with the West. They want Russia to be close with Britain and France. They will always do that which they want the British, whatever they think is of benefit to the British. So they want a war for that reason. And of course, the oligarchs in Russia want a war. They want to use a war in order to try to put pressure on the Tsar to make concessions to their liberal friends in the Duma. And if there is a war, which now looks inevitable, we're going to see over the next couple of weeks and months, and who knows for how long, a sustained attempt by the oligarchs and their liberal allies to try to get the Tsar to appoint the liberals to all the senior positions in the government, and in effect to hand over the government to the control of the oligarchs and the liberals. And the oligarchs think they can do that because they control all the big factories, and they're in a position, there are already plans apparently to set up associations, economic associations, in parallel to those of the government, and to in effect seize control of Russia's war economy from the government. So they want a war for all these reasons. They want a war because they're pro-British. They want a war because they think they can use the war crisis, to extract political concessions from the Tsar and from the government, and in effect to gain control of the government. There are other people who want a war too, and here we have to talk about the sentiments of one very influential section of Russian society, people who, especially, sort of middle-class people who are, from whom, the class where most of the army officers, for example, those sort of people are drawn from. And here, one has to say straight away that it is impossible for these people to countenance the destruction of Serbia. They feel that this is a Slav nation, an Orthodox nation, a friend of Russia. There's a long history in Russia of supporting Serbia and the Balkan Slavs against the Ottomans, and they cannot countenance or accept any situation whereby Serbia is sacrificed to the Habsburgs. So it's not so much that these people want a war, it is that they see no choice but to defend Serbia in this kind of crisis. Now, it's important to stress that these people, middle-class society, if you like, is extremely influential in Russia. Anybody who says that Russia doesn't have a public opinion is completely wrong. If the Tsar were to hold out against all of these forces and say he's not prepared to have a war, he's going to follow the advice of Dornovos and of Rasputin and avoid a war and allow Serbia to be destroyed, then he will be inviting upon himself a huge political crisis, a crisis from the liberals, from the oligarchs, from nationalist opinion, if you like, within the military, within the bureaucracy, within the middle classes, and his position would be threatened. Now, a much stronger Tsar, perhaps the Tsar's father, would have the authority to face all that down. Nicholas is not in that kind of strong position, and realistically, I don't think it's going to happen. He doesn't want a war. He understands the risks of a war. So do many people in the government, but if war comes, they will have to face up to it. They can't run away from it. They will fight it.
Is that how this is being sold, or how it's going to be sold to the Russian people, to the population? That this is about, we have to get involved because it's about coming to the aid of another brotherly Orthodox Slav nation? I mean, is that how they're going to sell this to the vast population?
Yes, I think that is how they're going to try to sell it to the vast population. The problem is that this is where we come up against some of the internal problems within Russia. I mean, we've talked about Rasputin, and we've talked about the fact that, from his place in Siberia, he is frankly uninterested in the Balkan Slavs. One senses that, it's educated society that cares about these issues, about the Balkans and about the Slavs in the Balkans. The peasants, the industrial workers in the factories, these sort of people perhaps are not particularly interested in these things. So, arguing, that you're defending the Slavs, that you're defending the Slavs of the Balkans, might not have as much traction as some people in the government hope it will. I think that in one respect, the Tsar is fortunate, because all the indications are that it will be Germany that's going to declare war on Russia. As I said, a crazy idea for the Germans to do, but at least it looks like it's going to be the Germans who are going to take the initiative. So the Tsar does have another possible line. He can say that he is defending Russia from German attack. And I think that that's perhaps going to be an even more important part of, the message that the government is going to try to reach out to the people. Now, I think that is something that Russian society, the massive Russian society, would probably, respond to. But that, of course, depends very much on how clear the government is in conveying that message, and to what extent other sections, the more educated sections of Russian society, the liberals, the oligarchs, the nationalists, all those forces, unite behind the government in pursuing that objective. If they all quarrel with each other, which unfortunately looks only too likely, then the risk is that that message will get muddled.
Yeah. Real quick.
There is one other. There is. I should quickly say there is one other group, of course, for whom a war might be an advantage, and that's, of course, Lenin and his grouping. Now, Lenin is in exile. He's in exile at the moment, but as I said, he's developed this very strong apparatus across this organization across Russia, and to be very clear, he's a very effective political operator.
Where in exile?
He's in Switzerland. He's in Switzerland, I believe, at the moment. So, I mean, from his point of view, a war. I mean, he's going to oppose war because he says war is imperialist and all of that. But he's probably at the same time going to calculate that if there is a war, that's going to weaken the whole political structure in Russia, and it will give him the opening. So I'm not saying he's exactly agitating for a war. Openly, he will oppose a war. But in practice, if there is a war, I think he's very well positioned to take advantage of it.
He will capitalize on the opportunity that is presented to him.
Absolutely. And he is a single-minded, utterly ruthless, utterly focused man. I mean, where everybody else is all over the place, where Nicholas perhaps is a bit more focused than some of the people around him. In fact, I suspect a lot more focused than the people around him. Pretty much everyone else in the political class, except people like Mr. Dornovo, hardly in a position, it seems to me, to match Lenin's extraordinary singleness of purpose and focus on the main objective. So, as I've said many times, lots of people in Russia think they can use Lenin. What's going to end up happening is they're all going to be used by him, if they're not careful.
All right, we'll leave it there then.
I would
On
just
that
like to
note.
add one
Yeah.
one quick thing, which is about Rasputin, and this is, I think, an important.
Yes.
It's just an observation, just a quick observation. Rasputin obviously has suffered this assassination attempt. Now, lots of people have talked about Rasputin having all kinds of mystical powers, that and supposedly that he's a great healer, and that there's even stories that he's immune from attack. Well, he clearly isn't, because somebody has just launched an assassination attempt. He was severely wounded. He couldn't heal himself. He had to go into hospital, and at one point he was actually pretty close to death. So, I say this because, the liberals in particular, and the oligarch-controlled media, have been quietly promoting this story about Rasputin as some sort of almost supernatural figure. I mean, he clearly isn't. I mean, I just add that point in because, as I said, I'm sure we'll be hearing an awful lot more of this over the next couple of years.
No, I agree. There's no doubt that he's definitely not some sort of healer or some supernatural figure. But I will say this, and I'm not defending Rasputin. I heard that the attack was pretty brutal, and that he had much of his abdomen was pretty much out, and you got to hand it to him. He is tough. I mean,
He's very.
He took a beating.
No, he is. He's extremely. I mean, I mean, what he is exceptionally strong, physical, virile man. I mean, that's partly, undoubtedly, one of his attractions. Part of the explanation for his extraordinary charisma. So, I mean, he's not a supernatural figure, but at the same time, there's no doubt at all about it. He is an extraordinarily strong man, and somebody who can come back from an attack like this and survive it. And you're absolutely right. This was an absolutely brutal attack. And you mentioned Heliodor, who's now, by the way, heading for the United States. Many people believe Heliodor was behind this.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. I mean, she was definitely a follower of Heliodor.
Yeah,
that we have confirmed.
yes.
But Rasputin's going to take a lot to get rid of him. That's my hunch. I mean, it's going to have to take a lot of effort to get rid of him.
I entirely agree. I completely agree. I absolutely agree.
Anyway. All right. We will leave it there. TheDuran.locals.com. Everybody, take care.